My name is Diane Whitmore. I'm 47, and for most of my younger son's wedding I stood near the back of the tent, holding a glass of champagne that had long since gone flat. I've learned to live at the edges of rooms. It wasn't always like that. Not long ago, I was the person other people waited on before a meeting started. The one whose name got dropped in hallways with a kind of respect I never had to ask for. I spent 2 decades building a reputation in corporate strategy that people used as a reference point. No family money behind me, no lucky break, just work. Back then, people called me sharp. Lately, nobody called me anything at all. Now I was just my son's mother, standing by the dessert table, watching him laugh with his new wife, feeling the odd, hard-won calm of someone who has already survived losing the thing she feared most. My son had my late mother's exact smile, and not one person in that tent knew that, because not one of them had been in the room 3 years earlier, when I sat beside her hospital bed for 2 straight years, watching a life I'd built get quietly dismantled by nobody's hand but Time's. To the guests, I was simply my sister's sibling, the one between jobs. The one people were polite to the way you're polite to something you feel sorry for. I let them believe it, because I had convinced myself that being overlooked was at least peaceful. What I didn't understand yet was that being underestimated isn't free. Somebody always shows up to collect the debt, and that night, somebody did. 3 years before that wedding, I got a phone call while standing in a glass-walled office on the 40th floor, days away from a promotion I had spent my whole career reaching for. My mother's voice came through the line with 2 words that erased every plan I had: pancreatic cancer, stage 4. She was 68, and the doctors weren't generous with their estimates. I didn't spend long deciding. I walked back into that office and withdrew my name from consideration, and I watched 20 years of ambition rearrange itself into something smaller and more urgent. My sister, Renee, was living in another state, established at a mid-level position she was terrified of losing. And when the family finally had the conversation about who would step back to care for our mother, she said it plainly. She wasn't going to throw away everything she'd built. I understood her more than anyone realised, because I'd built things too, and I knew exactly what it cost to walk away from them. So I volunteered, half out of love and half out of pride, not yet realising that the world keeps 2 separate ledgers, one for the people who stay behind and give things up, and one for the people who keep climbing. 2 years of oncology appointments, medication schedules, and 6 a.m. drives taught me a new language I never wanted to learn. My old life went quiet, then silent. My phone stopped ringing with people who once needed my opinion, and I didn't have the energy left to mourn that loss on top of everything else. But there were nights, in the fog between treatments, when my mother would surface with total clarity and take my hand. One of those nights she told me something I never forgot, that people will always judge you by the room you happen to be standing in, and I was not allowed to judge myself the same way. She died that spring, and at her funeral distant relatives began speaking about me like I was a cautionary tale. Poor thing. Look what she gave up. My sister flew in for 2 days, wore elegant black, cried beautifully in front of everyone who mattered, and somehow left that funeral as the grieving daughter, while I quietly became the tired woman who'd merely handled logistics. That was the moment I understood. My sister wasn't just building her own story. She was building it without me in it as anything more than a warning. A year passed. I did the slow bureaucratic work that follows a death, and eventually I started sleeping through the night again. Then my son called with real joy in his voice for the first time in ages. He was getting married to a woman named Hannah, kind and steady, clearly good for him. But near the end of that call, his voice dropped, and he asked me, gently and shamefully, not to react if his aunt brought up my unemployment at the wedding, because he didn't want a scene on his one day. He was 24, frightened of conflict, and in that single request he told me, without meaning to, exactly which sister the family had decided was the problem, not the one who mocked, but the one who might dare to mind being mocked. I told him, of course, and I meant it, though it cost me something I didn't have a name for at the time. Almost as an afterthought, I asked where he worked. He named the firm proudly, a strategy consultancy I knew intimately, because years earlier I had built a decision-mapping framework that firm had eventually adopted wholesale, the kind of idea that spreads through an industry until nobody remembers who invented it. My sister, it turned out, had built her entire career at that same firm, standing on a foundation she had no idea belonged to me. I chose not to say anything. Not out of strategy. I was simply too tired of explaining that I used to matter, and I decided I owed nobody my resume. At the rehearsal dinner, my sister arrived like she'd rented the room herself. New watch, new confidence, holding court by the window with stories that always ended in her being right, dropping the name of her CEO, a man named Grant Calloway, like it was a rosary bead, making sure I understood the gap between a woman who answered to someone powerful and a woman who answered to nobody. When Hannah's mother kindly asked what I did for a living, my sister answered before I could open my mouth, calling me between things with a fondness sharp enough to cut, and I let it go because it was my son's weekend and I had made a promise. Later, my sister produced a small fan of business cards at the table and in front of everyone asked if I had one to hand out too. I didn't. I hadn't made new cards in 3 years because I hadn't yet decided who I was going to be next, and I sat there with empty hands while her little cards lay across the tablecloth like proof of who counted and who didn't. The morning of the wedding, I helped my son with his tie the way my own father once taught me, and he apologised quietly for the phone call, and I told him honestly that keeping the peace that day wasn't a sacrifice, it was a gift I wanted to give him. I meant every word. What none of us knew yet was that peace wasn't entirely mine to protect. During the reception, my sister spent the evening orbiting a calm, silver-haired man in an impeccable suit, refreshing his drink, laughing slightly too long at everything he said, and I recognised the choreography instantly, because I had once been the person a room organised itself around, and I knew exactly what it looked like when someone wanted desperately to be noticed. Eventually she crossed the hall toward my table with him in tow, and I understood, the way you understand weather rolling in, that I was about to be used as a prop in her performance for her CEO. She gestured toward me with a bright, hostessy smile and said the words she'd clearly rehearsed, that I was her unemployed sister who lived off the family, that I'd been between things for years, bless my heart, delivered warmly enough that anyone who flinched would seem unkind for flinching. I laughed gently, the way I had trained myself to over 3 years of being described by people who were never in the room for the truth, and then I said the quietest, truest thing I could manage, that she was right. I didn't have a title anymore. I meant it as surrender. But the moment those words left my mouth, they stopped feeling like an apology. And across the table, the CEO went very still, set his glass down slowly, and looked at me with the kind of attention nobody had given me in 3 years. He asked my name. When I told him, he repeated it slowly and something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition, then disbelief. He asked if I was the same woman behind a well-known decision-mapping framework his entire firm still built its analytics around. I told him carefully that I had written an early version of it a long time ago. He exhaled, almost laughing, and told me that his firm had spent 3 years quietly searching for me every recruiting cycle, that he'd assumed I'd vanished into an NDA somewhere or gone overseas, and that he simply couldn't understand how someone that capable disappears without a trace. I told him plainly. My mother got sick. I stepped away to care for her. She died the following year. The silence that followed was total. My sister, sensing the ground shifting beneath her, made it worse by trying to minimize me one more time, saying dismissively that the field had moved on without me, and that was the sentence that finally cost her everything. Because she said it about a woman her own CEO had just called the backbone of his company, 5 minutes after introducing that same woman as a freeloader at her son's wedding. He turned to her, quiet and final, and told her that her ambition had never worried him, but what she'd just done, degrading her own sister to impress him, told him everything he needed to know. He said HR would be in touch Monday, and he said it without raising his voice the way you'd note the time. What surprised me most wasn't the vindication. It was that I didn't actually want her destroyed, and it took me a moment to understand why. My sister sat down heavily, and for one unguarded second she said, almost to herself, that I had always been the one people remembered. And in that sentence, I finally understood the thing she'd said on the phone 3 years earlier that I'd never been able to pass. She hadn't refused to care for our mother out of cruelty. She'd refused because she was terrified that if she ever stepped out of the spotlight, even briefly, the world would forget she existed at all. Her whole personality had been built on that fear. Later, alone with the CEO near a string of lights, I asked him directly not to fire my sister as a gift to me, if she'd crossed a real line at his company. That was his decision to make, but I wasn't going to build my next chapter on someone else's ruin. He respected that, and then made me a serious offer, a leadership role at his firm, a significant salary, and a promise to publicly restore my name to the industry within a single press release. He set his own business card on the table between us, the exact thing I'd been missing all weekend, offered by exactly the kind of powerful man who could make me real again on paper. I considered it hard, because everything in me that had gone hungry for validation over 3 years wanted to take it. But I also heard my mother's voice, clear as that last good week we'd shared. Don't measure yourself by the room you're standing in. And I understood finally that if I took his offer, I'd simply be trading one external measurement of my worth for another, just a more flattering one. So I thanked him sincerely, slid the card back across the table, and told him I didn't need to be restored because I had never actually gone missing. The room had simply forgotten how to see clearly. I told him I'd rather build my own table than take a seat at his, one where the first question people ask isn't about your title, but about who you took care of. He laughed, genuinely impressed, and offered to be my very first client instead. I walked away from that wedding having turned down a fortune and a throne, and I had never in my life felt richer. Today, my small firm is exactly that. 3 people, a handful of serious clients, including that same CEO, and it measures the right things. My sister left that company the following Monday, and eventually landed somewhere smaller, in another city. We're not close anymore, and I've stopped waiting for that to change. But last week, I interviewed a woman for a job at my firm who'd spent 3 years caring for her sick father, and when she reached the resume gap, she was clearly bracing for. I didn't ask about the gap at all. I asked her to tell me about her dad. She started crying, and then she started talking, and I knew before she finished that I was going to hire her. If there's a quiet woman in your life carrying more than the room can see, tell her today that you noticed. And if this story moved you, subscribe for more. I'll see you in the next one.